going to go ahead and look at how the trigger actually works in a Glock 19. We're going to be doing that, demonstrating with this Glock 19 Gen 2 factory cutaway. So obviously we have our gun, we have our trigger, and we have our, of course, the trigger dingus, right? And all the trigger dingus does is when it's in the forward position, it just blocks the trigger from going back. And you can see how it hinges on the trigger right there. As you depress it, it just is a lever arm that essentially seesaws into place, allowing the trigger to complete its travel. Now, the way that the trigger is connected to the firing pin is it's actually directly pulling on the firing pin. There's a sear surface attached directly to the firing pin, and it does that by way of the trigger bar. This whole gold piece of stamped steel is the trigger bar, and it presses directly on a sear surface that is part of the firing pin. And you can see once it gets back far enough, that trigger bar gets pushed down and it slips off of the sear surface, allowing the firing pin to spring forward, strike your primer, fire the gun. So I'm going to show you that one more time. You pull the trigger bar directly pulls the striker back to cock it. It then begins to slip down and off the sear surface, letting the firing pin go forward. If we look on the other side of the trigger bar, we can see why that trigger bar begins to move down towards the end of travel. It's because this rounded portion of the trigger bar begins to interact with the sloped surface on the connector. And as it pushes back on that sloped surface pushes the trigger bar down, allowing it to slip off of that sear surface and fire the gun. Now, the other part of the Glock trigger that you might have noticed is this little plunger right next to the firing pin that goes up and down as you pull the trigger. That's your firing pin block, and the way that works is there's another portion of the trigger bar, this raised portion right here, that actually just presses directly on that, forcing it up out of the way. And that firing pin block has to be up and out of the way in order for the firing pin to move forward and strike the primer. Overall, this is a very ingenious system, and now that I've seen how it works in a cutaway format, I see why so many factory Glocks come with, in my opinion, pretty poor triggers from the factory. And it has nothing to do with mushiness. I don't care about having a super glass rod break trigger or anything like that. I know that's like the biggest noob trap, is everyone wants a super crisp trigger. I don't mind the mushiness. My problem with the Glock is that with most factory Glocks, when I take the gun in one hand and I dry fire it, there is a tendency for that front sight to want to wiggle to the right. And the reason for that, I believe, is because on most factory brand new Glocks and newer Glocks that haven't been shot very much, that haven't been dry fired very much, they still have that rough edge from when the stamping die stamped out that trigger bar. And when that rough edge interacts with the sear, it creates a sort of unpredictable, or simply just a movement that isn't smooth as that trigger bar slips off the sear, that has a greater tendency to cause the sights to move and thus the gun to move as the shot breaks. The other part of the equation is these pistols tend to have a lot of over travel from the factory, and with just experimenting by making a small temporary over travel stop here in the trigger guard, I've been able to dry fire this pistol one-handed without the sights moving. This gun has essentially had a trigger job just by nature of being so old and being dry fired thousands and thousands and thousands of times, presumably because, you know, you can't really do anything with a factory cutaway like this except dry fire it. So those two mating surfaces, I mean, looking at them with a flashlight on them, they look very, very shiny and polished, and that's just because it's been dry fired so much. So yeah, stock Glock triggers, they're not terrible, certainly capable of being very good with essentially just a cleaned up surface on the trigger bar where it interacts with the firing pin and where it interacts with the connector, as well as having that over travel stop. So Glock in general is not my favorite pistol, it's not my first choice, but it's certainly a good pistol and it's not a bad choice. In any case, thank you all for watching. If you like this video, please go ahead and subscribe for more, leave a comment, and if you would like to support the channel directly, you can go ahead and click the join button next to the subscribe button to become a channel member and support the channel directly. So thank you to my channel members for supporting the channel directly, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you for watching.